Thank you, Matt. High praise indeed. Heroes, in my view, come in all shapes and sizes. And I'd like to share a few stories with you about why my children are my heroes. So, I've just come back from 2 years sailing around the world with my wife and my 3 young children. Let me introduce you. My daughter Bluebell, age 9, my son Columbus, age 7, and my daughter Willow, age just 2. In that photo there, we just arrived in the Marquesa Islands, which are some 4,000 miles off the South American coast in the middle of the Pacific. And the boat we arrived there in was the small blue one you can see in the background. Now, my children are not my heroes because of what we've done. They're my heroes because of what they've learned and how they applied those lessons. So, when my wife and I decided that we were going to sail around the world, we knew that we would need to undertake a special type of training. Training not just to deal with the world's toughest oceans, but to deal with living life in sort of everyday, cramped circumstances on a small boat, to dealing with tantrums, to dealing with everyday things like saying, how far is it away until we get there? And of course, the answer to that is sometimes, well, it's 3 weeks away. Now, my children are not perfect. I definitely don't want to give you that impression. And we are not perfect parents. We have the same moments that most other people and families have, where you say, Willow, don't get the Lego out. And 2 minutes later, the Lego is out everywhere, and she's got the bucket over her head, pretending not to see you. So the hero lesson that I want to share with you is all about focusing on what is right rather than what is wrong. Now, in our society, we're all trained and hardwired to look for things that are wrong. How many people do you notice start a sentence with, "the problem is"? And what I think is the hero training is learning to focus on what is right. So I want to share 3 stories with you about how I learned these lessons. So the first story is actually a lesson from my business and how we got the money together to make this happen. The second story is where we applied this with our children. And then the third story is when we had to use this in anger, when our lives were threatened, when we were in a very dangerous situation. So I'm going to wind the clock back to 2009. And this is when we had the first idea to go and sail around the world. And at that time, I was the co-owner of a small consulting business. We had sales of about £400,000, and we were losing money. And the idea of going and sailing around the world was utterly laughable, which, of course, is what everybody did when we told them. But what we had is we had time, we had energy, and we had a committed decision that we were going to go and do this. We were going to go and sail around the world. So I started changing things in my business. Fast forward now 2 years, it's 2011, and nothing had materially changed with the business. And I started doing more and more implementation. I was changing things, I was hiring staff, I was creating new products, I was doing all sorts of different things. And my business partner took me aside and he said, Caspar, you need to change what you're doing because everybody is going to leave otherwise because you're being a nightmare. And it was one of those slap-in-the-face moments that it's like, okay, so I need to do something different. So I went and relearned about what it takes to be a leader, what it takes to build a team. And the area that we spent most time focusing on, that I spent most time focusing on, was all about values-based leadership. Now, I've worked in large corporates, and I've been involved in values exercises. And in my past, when you hear about that, your eyes roll over and think, oh gosh, it's the values, we'll do this, and then a few days' time it'll be over and we'll come back to it again next year. But what I did in my business was we defined the values, but we didn't just stop there. Every single week, we focused on those values, what was right, what do we like seeing that people were doing. And that, for me, is the power of values. It gives you an opportunity to talk about the things that are right, build on people's strengths. And what we did in the business is that the following year, we grew faster than we'd ever grown before. We made more profit. And ultimately, that's what enabled me to put a team in place that meant that we could sell the business whilst we were actually sailing across the Pacific Ocean. So I did all that corporate learning and focusing on what was right rather than what was wrong through the power of values. What I then did was the unusual piece, was that I applied all of that at home with our children. And we spent time creating our values. This was the actual values picture, and it sits in our living room still. And we defined the values with the children. We talked about it, but we didn't just stop there. Every single day, we would talk about our values. And over breakfast on the boat, we would do values prizes in the morning. And they would go something like this. I'd say, Columbus, my son, today you're going to get my values prize for the value of understanding, because you saw your young sister wasn't feeling very well. You got her some water, you got her a blanket, and you made sure she was okay. And what we were doing is we're continually focusing on what is right rather than what was wrong. What are the behaviors that you want to see more of? Because how often do you see, and I remember training in workplace in the 90s, and people say, don't do that, don't do that. And all you hear is the thing that you don't want them to do. So the power of doing this, it's all about building a muscle and training yourself to focus on what's right rather than what's wrong. So that's the second story. The third story, when we really needed this. So this is the only photo that I have from that time. And we are 500 miles from the nearest piece of land. So that's equivalent distance from here to John O'Groats in Scotland. And we had complete power failure on the boat. Now, what does that mean? Well, on land, you have power failure. You call out an electrician, they come and fix it. But out there, what it means is you have no engine, no navigation, so you don't know where you are. You have no lights, you have no cooker, you have no water pump, you have no winches, nothing. And it's probably one of the most lonely and scary feelings you can have, that you're just out there on your own in one of the most remote parts of the world. And I'd put my wife and my children in danger. So what do you do? Well, we lived our values, of course. And together with the children, we started to think, okay, what do we do? So the first thing we did, one of our values was the word laugh. Let's find the humor in the situation. So the toilets were out of action. So we introduced the children to the bucket, the new toilet, affectionately called the bucket and chuck it system. So within minutes, the kids were howling with laughter as they lined up on deck to poo in the bucket and chuck it over the side. So that was the first part. But then over the next 4 days, my wife and I, we had to hand steer the boats because we had no autopilot as well. And we were steering for half an hour at a time each. And the thing that I'm most proud of, and why my kids are my heroes, is how they responded in that time. Because not only did they find the humor in the situation, but they lived the values of love, of understanding, of compassion, of happiness. We found laughter, we looked after each other, and we were genuinely a team working together. So when we arrived some 4 days later in this remote island of Niue, we were utterly exhausted, physically, mentally, and emotionally. We'd literally been steering by the sun, the moon, and the stars. But I think it was my proudest moment as a parent, seeing how my kids reacted in that moment. And again, I think it's all down to this training. It's not what you do once, it's what you do every single day that makes a difference. So we survived, and we came through it. And as I say, my children learned about the power of focusing on what is right rather than what is wrong. So what are my takeaways for you? I want to share a couple of things. The first thing is this formula, and I teach my kids this formula. And it's E plus R equals O. Some of you may have heard of this before, where E is the event, something that happens to you. You have power failure in the middle of the ocean. You lose your job. Somebody gets hurt. Something happens to you. You can guarantee in your life you will have events, things that are going to happen. R is your reaction. What do you do in response to that event? That's 100% under your control. O is the outcome. What's going to happen at the end of that? Notice it doesn't say the event equals the outcome. It's the event plus your reaction that determines that outcome. And that's what I get my kids to think about. What's your response? So when my daughter's back in school now, and she comes back and says, I've only got 30% in this exam because she's missed something. And I say, well, what did you do about it? And she says, well, I stayed late after school for an extra 2 hours to figure out where I got wrong. And she's learned that emotional resilience of focusing on her reaction. What can she do to make a difference? So, how can you be a hero? 3 things I want to share with you. 1, focus. What are you focused on? Are you focused on what is right or what is wrong? Maybe think about doing a values exercise in your business, in your family, in any team that you're involved in. But then reinforce it regularly. What are you talking about? What's the conversation? Focus on those things that are right. The second thing, E plus R equals O. Remember, it's your reaction to any event, and we're all going to have stuff that comes up at some point in our lives. The only thing that makes a difference is how you react to it and how you respond to it. So the outcome comes from that. And the final thing, appreciation. What underpins all of this is noticing things and telling people about those good things. So I ask all of you, every day, find one person that you know and pick out something that they've done and tell them about it. Tell them what you liked about it. Be specific, be detailed, because people remember that stuff. And that, for me, is what the essence of this is about building heroes. Focus on what's right rather than what's wrong. Thank you.